An HOA president parked herself outside my house for a jaw-dropping 72 hours, all because I wouldn't let her scrutinize my wall paint. Turns out she was obsessed with 47 Shades of White and completely unraveled over it. But the real hilarity unfolded when the cops rolled up, and by the end, 3 officers were doubled over, laughing so hard tears streamed down their faces. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Because the reason behind their hysterics is the most absurd paint color saga you'll ever hear. It all kicked off at HOA on a Sunday morning when my doorbell erupted, not just once or twice, but 17 times in 2 minutes. I know because my security system keeps a meticulous log. Peeking through my video doorbell, I spotted a woman in her late 40s standing on my porch, armed with a mountain of paperwork that could rival an IRS audit. Her blonde hair was styled to perfection, untouched by the morning breeze, and she rocked a blazer that practically screamed, "I need to speak to your manager," while gripping a clipboard like it was her battle shield. Behind her stood a younger guy, awkwardly holding a massive color chart, the kind you'd find at a paint store, only comically oversized. "Open this door right now! I need to inspect your interior," she bellowed, her voice hitting a pitch that could make dogs 3 blocks away start howling. I hit the intercom button, keeping my tone even, despite the irritation bubbling inside. "I'm sorry. Today's not a good time. Can I help you with something?" Her face flushed a shade of red that definitely wasn't on her precious chart. "I'm Brenda Morrison, president of the Oak Hill Estates Homeowners Association, and I've had 5 separate reports that your interior walls violate our community standards." I couldn't hold back a laugh. "You can't possibly see my wall color from the street. How would anyone even know?" "Stick around for the chaos that unfolds. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share. With us, if you've had any confrontation with the HOA, we'll narrate your story on our channel. That's when things took a turn for the bizarre. I have drone footage. I saw through your windows. Your walls are clearly not regulation eggshell. White. She waved her phone at my camera, showing what looked like a poorly focused image of something beige. The younger man behind her nodded enthusiastically, holding up the color chart and pointing to a specific shade. I felt my hands tremble slightly, remembering my old apartment where the landlord would barge in whenever he pleased, criticizing everything from my furniture placement to the way I folded my towels. But this was my house, my property, my rights. "Ma'am, that's invasion of privacy." "I could actually sue you for flying a drone to spy through my windows," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the uncomfortable memories surfacing. Brenda's face went from red to purple. "You have to let me in. This is the law." She pulled out her phone again, frantically showing me what appeared to be a website. Even through my doorbell camera, I could see it was clearly a homemade site, complete with clip art and Comic Sans font. Article 247.3 clearly states that all interior walls must be painted in approved eggshell white SW. Eggshell white shade, number whatever. Just then, Mrs. Roberts, my 82-year-old neighbor, walked by with her morning coffee. She stopped, looked at Brenda, and shook her head with a knowing smile. "Oh, you're doing this again, Brenda? Last month it was my house, now Mason's. When will you learn?" This revelation made Brenda even more agitated. "Mrs. Roberts, your case is still pending review. Don't interfere with official HOA business, Mrs." Roberts laughed, actually laughed, and continued walking. "There is no HOA, dear. There never has been, but you keep trying." I watched through my camera as Brenda's composure cracked slightly. The young man with the color chart looked confused, glancing between Brenda and Miss Roberts. "Aunt Brenda, I thought you said Quiet Carl," she snapped. "So this was a family operation? Interesting." I made a mental note to look into the legitimacy of this supposed HOA. "Listen, Miss Morrison," I said, trying to be reasonable. I'm not opening my door and I'm not letting you inspect anything. If you have legitimate concerns, please send them in writing through proper legal channels. What happened next should have been a warning sign of the insanity to come. Brenda planted her feet firmly on my porch, raised her clipboard like a battle standard, and declared in a voice that probably reached the next county, "If you won't open this door and submit to a proper inspection, then I will camp right here on this sidewalk until you comply with community standards. This is not over, Mason Brooks. I have all the time in the world and justice for proper paint. Colors will prevail." She turned to Carl, who was still holding the color chart with diminishing enthusiasm. "Carl, go get the camping supplies from my car. We're setting up base camp." I watched in disbelief as she actually started directing Carl to unload what appeared to be a full camping setup from a yellow SUV parked in my driveway. "You can't be serious," I muttered to myself. But as I watched her unfold a camping chair and position it strategically for maximum visibility from my front window, I realized she was dead serious. I laughed to myself. She couldn't possibly be serious about camping on my property. The next morning, I opened my curtains and couldn't believe my eyes. There she was. Brenda Morrison had actually set up a full camping site on the public sidewalk in front of my house. Not just any camping setup either. She had an eggshell white tent, of course, a folding table covered with paint samples, multiple color charts arranged like battle maps, and a banner that reared justice for proper paint colors, in what I can only assume was meant to be an intimidating font. It was 5:30 in the morning, and she was already live streaming to her phone, which was propped up on a tripod. "Good morning, fellow patriots of proper home aesthetics. This is day one of my vigil for color correctness. Behind me is the home of one Mason Brooks, a color criminal who refuses to comply with basic standards of interior decency." I grabbed my coffee and pulled up her stream on my laptop. She had 3 viewers, someone named Richard Morrison, probably her husband, someone called Mom Morrison, self-explanatory, and herself on another device. The absurdity of her setup became clearer as the morning progressed. She had created laminated cards with violation codes that she'd made up, each one more ridiculous than the last. Code 47B, failure to maintain consistent color temperature across all interior surfaces. Code 12A, suspected use of hardware store brand paint instead of designer quality. She read these aloud to her phone, occasionally pausing to hold up paint, chips to the camera as if they were evidence in a murder trial. Around 7 a.m., her husband, Richard, arrived with supplies. He was a tall, tired, ill-looking man who moved with the resignation of someone who'd given up fighting this particular battle long ago. "Brought your breakfast, honey," he said, handing her a bag. "And your medications," he added pointedly. "Don't forget to take them." Brenda waved him off, too focused on arranging her paint samples in what she called the spectrum of justice. Richard caught my eye through my window and gave me an apologetic shrug before retreating to his car. First day was almost entertaining. Brenda had created a full presentation setup with a projector screen hanging from her tent displaying a PowerPoint titled "The White Paper on Paint Color Crimes, a Comprehensive Analysis." She spent 4 hours going through hundreds of slides explaining in excruciating detail why off-white was, and I quote, "an enemy of civilization and property values." By noon, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, but not for the reason Brenda hoped. Mrs. Roberts had brought out lawn chairs and was selling popcorn for $2 a bag. Jorge, my neighbor from 2 houses down, had set up his own chair and was taking bets on how long Brenda would last. "I gave her 48 hours max," he said, counting a small stack of bills. Last time, she only made it 36 hours before Richard dragged her home. The details that emerged about Brenda's previous campaigns were both hilarious and slightly concerning. Apparently, she had done this to the Hendersons over their deck stain too orange. the Gwens about their shutters, wrong shade of black, and poor Mr. Peterson about his garden shed, Robin's egg blue instead of approved sky blue. Each campaign had lasted between 24 and 48 hours before either Richard intervened or the targets gave in just to get peace. But I was determined not to give in. As the afternoon wore on, Brenda's presentation became increasingly unhinged. She had an entire section on the psychological profile of off-white users that included wild speculation about childhood trauma and rebellious tendencies against societal norms. She'd even created a color wheel of criminal whites with names like Anarchist Alabaster and Deviant Dove. Tommy, the regular pizza delivery guy, arrived with my lunch order and stopped dead when he saw the scene. Brenda immediately intercepted him. "Excuse me, young man, do you have a permit to deliver food to a code violator?" Tommy, who couldn't have been older than 19, looked at her like she'd grown a second head. "Lady, I just deliver pizzas. I don't need a permit for that. That's what they all say," Brenda shot back, pulling out another clipboard. "I'll need to see your food handling license, your vehicle registration, and a written statement about the interior paint colors of every house you've delivered to today." Tommy looked at me through my window. I shrugged and held up a $20 bill. He dodged around Brenda, sprinted to my door, grabbed the money, and practically ran back to his car. "I'll add obstruction of justice to your file," Brenda yelled after him. Day 2 brought escalation. Brenda had apparently spent the entire night upgrading her setup. By 5:30 a.m., she had installed battery-pounded speakers and was broadcasting what she called the audio white paper on paint crimes. Imagine being woken up by a woman reading in a monotone voice the supposed 57 subcategories of white paint and their psychological impacts on property values. She had also recruited reinforcements, though recruited might be too strong a word. Her nephew Carl was back, looking significantly less enthusiastic, and wearing a T-shirt that said, "I'm just here for the community service hours." An elderly woman named Doris had also joined, though she seemed more interested in the free coffee and donuts Brenda provided than in any color justice. The police had been called twice by other neighbors, but since Brenda was technically on public property and wasn't making noise during quiet hours, they couldn't do much. Officer Chen, who responded to the second call, actually stood and watched Brenda's presentation for a few minutes, his expression growing more bewildered by the second. "Ma'am, did you just say that using flat paint instead of eggshell is a sign of sociopathic tendencies?" he asked. Brenda beamed, thinking she'd found an ally. "Yes, finally, someone who understands. You see, the light reflection patterns of flat paint create a psychological environment that—" "Okay, that's enough, officer," Chen interrupted, turning to me. "Sir, I'm sorry you're dealing with this. Unfortunately, unless she threatens you or trespasses on your property, she's within her rights to do whatever this is." He gestured vaguely at the tent, presentations, and growing pile of paint samples. By afternoon, Brenda had escalated to live demonstrations. She had samples of approved whites and criminal whites, holding them up to different lights to show their deviant undertones. The gathering crowd was taking pictures, but not in support. Brendan, a 22-year-old neighbor, was making videos with captions like, "Day 12 of Paint Lady losing her mind." Apparently, this wasn't her first rodeo. Even the local dogs had figured out the routine, congregating near her tent because Doris kept dropping donut crumbs. But the third day is when Brenda truly lost touch with reality. Jorge had suggested in what I'm sure he thought was a joke that I should troll her back. He probably didn't expect me to take him seriously. I spent that evening preparing my response. I went to the hardware store and bought poster boards in the most offensive colors I could find: salmon pink, lime green, jet black, and something called aggressive orchid that hurt to look at. I carefully placed them in each of my front windows, making sure they were clearly visible from the street. The next morning, Brenda's reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. He was in the middle of live streaming her Day 3 victory update when she noticed the posters. The shriek that came out of her mouth probably registered on seismographs 3 states away. Salmon pink. He has salmon pink in his windows. This is a declaration of war. She fumbled with her phone, nearly dropping it in her panic, and called someone. Richard. He has salmon pink and a lime green. It's an abomination. Get down here with the emergency color remediation kit. Through my security camera, I watched as she paced frantically, pointing at my windows and shouting into her phone. Carl tried to calm her down, but she pushed past him to get a closer look at my window displays. This is intentional provocation. He's mocking the sacred standards of interior aesthetics. By the end of Day 3, Brenda had made a final declaration to her remaining viewers. Tomorrow I will present scientific evidence that will prove beyond doubt that Mason Brooks is guilty of color crimes. Justice will prevail. As I closed my curtains that night, enjoying the quiet after she'd finally retreated to presumably shower and sleep at her actual home, she'd been making quick trips back, Richard dropping off supplies. I had no idea what scientific evidence she thought she had, but knowing Brenda, it would be something special. She shouted through her megaphone, "Tomorrow, 6 QAM, I will show this entire neighborhood the truth." I turned off the lights and went to bed, not knowing that at 6 a.m. the next morning, I would wake up to a scene that would make me call the police. Week 2 began with Brenda elevating her campaign to levels I didn't think were possible. She had hired what she called a color expert, who turned out to be her unemployed cousin, Carl, wearing a white lab coat with 15 different highlighters sticking out of the pocket. Carl had apparently downloaded a free color analysis app on his phone and was now walking around my property line holding his phone up to my windows and making professional observation. The spectral analysis indicates a 0.3% deviation toward warm tones, Carl announced, in what I assume he thought was a scientific voice. Brenda practically glowed with triumph. Aha, scientific proof of color crimes. I watched from my home office window as she updated her PowerPoint presentation with Carl's findings, adding graphs and charts that looked like they'd been made by someone who had just discovered Excel. The level of detail in her newfound scientific approach was both impressive and disturbing. She had created an entire methodology for paint crime detection, complete with forms that Carl filled out every hour. Time of observation, weather conditions, angle of sunlight, and perceived warmth deviation were all meticulously recorded. She even had Carl wearing a lanyard that said Certified Color Technician. Though, when Jorge asked where the certification came from, Carl mumbled something about an online course that turned out to be a YouTube video about mixing watercolors. The neighbors had started a group chat specifically to share updates about Brenda's antics. My phone buzzed constantly with messages like, "She's got a protractor now," and Carl is measuring shadows to determine paint undertones. That afternoon, I was having coffee with Jorge when he made an observation that would change the course of this bizarre war. "You know, Mason, she's never going to stop unless you make her look completely ridiculous. Trust me, I've lived here for 10 years. The only thing that stops Brenda is public embarrassment." He was right. Of course, my subtle trolling with the colored posters had only fueled her determination. It was time to take things to the next level. "I just want to live in peace," I told him. "I dealt with enough invasive behavior from my last landlord. I don't need someone policing my wall colors." Jorge nodded sympathetically. "Then you need to out-crazy the crazy. It's the only way." Jorge shared stories about Brenda's past crusades that made my situation seem almost mild. There was the time she tried to mandate that all doorknobs in the neighborhood be brushed nickel instead of brass, camping outside the hardware store to intercept neighbors buying the wrong fixtures, or when she attempted to create a grass height tribunal with rulers and weekly measurement. Each campaign followed the same pattern: escalation, public spectacle, eventual embarrassment, and temporary retreat. The key, Jorge explained, is to make the embarrassment so memorable that she'll think twice before targeting you again. He was speaking from experience, having once defeated a Brenda campaign against his garden gnomes by organizing a gnome pride parade that attracted local news coverage. The next few days became a game of escalating absurdity. Brenda started showing up in different disguises trying to gain access to my house. Monday, she dressed as a delivery driver, complete with a brown uniform she'd clearly bought online. The only problem, she was still wearing her signature high heels and carrying color swatches instead of packages. When I didn't answer the door, she left a delivery notice that was actually another paint violation warning. Tuesday brought plumber Brenda carrying a wrench in one hand and inexplicably paint samples in the other. "I'm here to check your pipes," she said unconvincingly to my doorbell camera. "Pipes that might be affecting your wall color through moisture science." I didn't even dignify that with a response. The disguises became increasingly elaborate and desperate. On Wednesday, she attempted to pass as a census taker, but her official government questions all related to interior paint. Preferences. Question 1, on a scale of 1 to 10, how committed are you to proper wall maintenance? Question 2, have you ever harbored sympathies for non-approved color schemes? Thursday's attempt was perhaps the most pathetic. Painter Brenda arrived offering a free color consultation, but had forgotten to bring actual paint, brushes, or any tools associated with painting. She stood at my door holding just color swatches and a clipboard, insisting she needed to come inside to assess the situation. By Friday, she had given up on costumes and instead tried to claim she was hosting a neighborhood safety meeting in my driveway. When I pointed out that she couldn't host meetings on private property, she measured exactly where the public sidewalk ended and held her meeting one in from the property line. Wednesday was census taker Brenda with a clipboard asking official government questions that all somehow related to interior paint preferences. Thursday featured painter Brenda offering a free color consultation but forgetting to bring actual paint. By Friday, the neighborhood had turned it into entertainment. Jorge was taking bets on what costume would appear next, and Mrs. Roberts had started a scoring system for creativity versus believability. The local coffee shop had even created a drink special called the Eggshell White Latte. It was just a regular latte, but the name brought in curious customers. But Brenda wasn't just relying on disguises. She had formed what she called the Color Justice Alliance, which consisted of herself, the perpetually confused Carl, the elderly Doris, who openly admitted she was only there for the free coffee and because it's better than watching television, and Brandon, who thought the whole thing was performance art for his social media channels. Their meetings were held on my sidewalk, complete with an easel displaying the crimes of beige, a comprehensive analysis. I watched one evening as Brenda spent 4 hours explaining color theory to her alliance while Doris napped in her chair, and Brandon made videos with captions like, "Is this real life?" Carl dutifully took notes, though I noticed he was mostly doodling. The situation reached new heights of absurdity when Brenda decided that ground-level observation wasn't enough. At 6:00 one morning, I was jolted awake by a mechanical whirring sound. Looking out my bedroom window, I saw Brenda in a rented cherry picker rising slowly toward my second-floor windows. She was clutching her color charts and had a camera around her neck, presumably to document whatever color crimes she imagined she'd find. The sight of a middle-aged woman in business attire rising past my window on a cherry picker at dawn, holding paint samples, was so surreal that for a moment I wondered if I was still dreaming. Then she saw me through the window, standing there in my pajamas, and started taking pictures frantically. The invasion of privacy sent a familiar chill down my spine. Memories of my old landlord barging into my apartment, criticizing my lifestyle. Choices and threatening eviction over minor issues came flooding back. My hands started shaking as I reached for my phone. This had gone too far. "This is harassment!" I shouted through the window, but Brenda was already documenting something on her clipboard, occasionally holding up color swatches to my window for comparison. The cherry picker wobbled slightly, and I noticed Brenda gripping the sides with white knuckles. That's when I realized she was afraid of heights, but was so committed to her cause that she'd overcome her fear just to peer into my windows. There's something both admirable and terrifying about that level of dedication to being wrong. I dialed the emergency line, my voice shaky but determined. "There's a woman in a cherry picker trying to photograph the inside of my bedroom. She's been harassing me for 2 weeks about paint colors. Please send someone." But as it turned out, Brenda had made a critical error. In her enthusiasm to document my supposed color crimes, she had risen too high and was now frozen with fear, clutching the cherry picker's basket and unable to operate the controls to come down. Because the person who arrived wasn't just any officer. Officer Danny Martinez pulled up to find Brenda Morrison still stuck 20 feet in the air, clutching her color charts like a lifeline and alternating between shouting about paint violations and whimpering about the height. "Officer, arrest him! Rescue me first, then arrest him!" she called down, her voice a mixture of authority and panic. Martinez looked up at her, then at me, then back at her, his expression suggesting this wasn't his first encounter with Brenda. "Mrs. Morrison." "Not again," he sighed, pulling out his radio. "This is Martinez. I'm going to need the fire department at Maple Street. Yes, it's the color lady. Yes, again." He turned to me with a weary smile. "You must be the new victim." "Mason Brooks, right?" "I heard about the camping situation. You know about this?" I asked, surprised. Martinez nodded, watching as Brenda tried to maintain her dignity while clearly terrified. "Last year she did this to Mr. Johnson over his garage door. Color insisted. Beige wasn't beige enough. Took us 3 hours to talk her down from his roof." He pulled out a small notebook and flipped through it. Before that, it was the Henderson's deck stain, the Nyan's shutters, and my personal favorite. She once called 911 because someone painted their garden gnome the wrong shade of red. He showed me the notes, and I could see a pattern of escalating paint incidents going back 3 years. We've been trying to get her to seek help, but she insists everyone else is the problem. Carl appeared from behind Brenda's tent, looking mortified. "Officer Martinez, thank goodness. Aunt Brenda made me rent the cherry picker, but I told her it was a bad idea. She said she had to document the evidence before the HOA tribunal." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "What HOA tribunal?" Carl shifted uncomfortably. "The one she's planning to hold in the park tomorrow. She made me build a judge's bench. I got it from a garage sale last year when she did this to the Hendersons." The fire truck arrived with its ladder, and 2 firefighters began the process of rescuing Brenda. Even in her terrified state, she managed to shout instructions. "Careful with my evidence binder. Those photos are crucial for the prosecution." One of the firefighters, a young woman named Chen, looked at Martinez with raised eyebrows. "The prosecution?" "Don't ask," Martinez replied. While we waited for the fire department, Brenda managed to overcome her fear long enough to shout down her demands. "Officer, I need you to witness this. That man is harboring illegal paint colors. I have photographic evidence." "Carl, show him." the binder. Carl reluctantly produced a 3-ring binder that had to be at least 500 pages thick. Martinez flipped through it with professional patience while I looked over his shoulder. The binder was labeled Evidence of Color Violations, the case against Mason Brooks, and contained hundreds of photos of white walls, different angles, different lighting, different times of day, but all showing essentially the same off-white walls. Tab 1 was labeled The 30,000-Year History of Eggshell White. Tab 47 contained drone surveillance evidence. The last tab, which must have been close to tab 200, was titled Psychological Profile of Salmon Pink Users. The level of obsessive detail was staggering. She had weather reports for each day of observation, charts showing the angle of sunlight at different times, and even a section on historical paint crimes in the neighborhood that went back to the 1970s. There were photos of my house from every conceivable angle, some clearly taken from her drone, others from the sidewalk, and a few that looked like they'd been shot from neighboring yards. She'd even created a color gradient chart showing the devolution of my wall color from acceptable near weight to criminal off-weight. Martinez looked increasingly concerned as he flipped through the pages. "This is extensive," he said diplomatically. "Has she been on your property to take any of these?" I pointed to several photos that were clearly taken from inside my backyard. "Those are from last week. I have security footage of her climbing my fence at 3 a.m, ma'am." Martinez called up to Brenda, who was now being helped down by firefighters. "These all look like the same color to me, just white walls." This was apparently the wrong thing to say. Even in her terrified state, Brenda found the energy to be outraged. The same, this one is clearly ivory. This one is cream. This one is winter snow. Are you colorblind, officer?" Once safely on the ground, though still shaking from her aerial adventure, Brenda immediately launched into presentation mode. She pulled out a color measurement device that looked like it costs more than my monthly mortgage payment. "This is a professional-grade spectrophotometer," she announced. "It can detect color variations down to 0.01%. I demand you test his walls immediately." Martinez looked at me apologetically. "Sir, would you mind if we just humor her for a moment? Sometimes it's easier to prove her wrong with her own tools." I shrugged. I had nothing to hide. My walls were painted in a perfectly normal shade of off-white, probably whatever the previous owners had chosen. But then Brenda made a tactical error. "While we're at it, we should test my house as the control sample. I'll show you what real eggshell white looks like." We formed an odd procession. Martinez, Brenda, Carl, carrying the equipment, and me walking to Brenda's house 2 doors down. Several neighbors came out to watch, sensing that something entertaining was about to happen. Jorge gave me a thumbs up. Mrs. Roberts had her phone out ready to record. Brandon was already live streaming. The walk to Brenda's house became a parade of sorts. More neighbors emerged, some carrying coffee, others pulling out phones. By the time we reached Brenda's front door, we had an audience of at least 20 people. Brenda seemed oblivious to the crowd, focused entirely on proving her point. "You'll see," she kept muttering. "Scientific evidence, irrefutable proof, color justice. At last." She unlocked her door with shaking hands, still recovering from her cherry-picker ordeal, and led us to her living room. The interior was exactly what I had expected. Stark white walls, white furniture, white curtains, even white picture frames containing photos of other white rooms. It looked like a showroom for a store that only sold one color. Brenda positioned the device against her living room wall with the reverence of a priest handling holy relics. "Now watch," she said, pressing the button. "This will show perfect eggshell white SW70. The device beeped. The screen displayed off-white warm undertones. Deviation from pure white 12%. The silence that followed was beautiful. Brenda stared at the device, then at her wall, and then nabbed the device again. No, the machine is broken. Deep state interference. Color conspiracy. Just then, Richard Morrison pulled into the driveway. He took one look at the scene, his wife having a meltdown over paint colors, a police officer trying not to laugh, neighbors recording everything, and sighed deeply. "Brenda, honey, remember when we had the house painted last year? You specifically asked for whisper white because you said eggshell white was too harsh." Brenda's face went through several colors, none of which were approved whites. That's but Mom," Martinez said gently. "I think it's time we had a talk about harassment and trespassing laws." But Brenda wasn't done. "This isn't over," she declared, pointing dramatically at me. "Tomorrow I'm convening a formal tribunal, a paint court, and you," she pointed at me, "will be the defendant." The next morning, I woke up to find that Brenda had transformed the public park across from our street into what could only be described as a paint court. She had somehow convinced the city that she was holding a community beautification meeting and had set up an entire courtroom scene on the park lawn. There was an actual judge's bench, the one Carl mentioned, buying at a garage sale, a witness stand made from stacked milk crates, and rows of folding chairs for an A banner reading "The People vs. Massenbrook. Justice for proper paint hung between two trees." By 9 a.m. about 50 neighbors had gathered, but not for the reason Brenda hoped. Jorge had brought a cooler full of sodas to sell. Mrs. Roberts had upgraded from popcorn to a full snack stand. Someone had even called a taco truck, which parked nearby with a special menu. Paint court tacos, $5. All colors welcome. The setup was more elaborate than I'd expected. Brenda had created a full legal framework for her paint court, complete with a printed color code of justice that she'd bound into booklets and distributed to anyone who would take one. The booklets contained such gems as Article 1, the fundamental right to color consistency, and Article 15, penalties for willful color deviation. She'd even designed a seal for her court, featuring a paintbrush crossed with a gavel. Carl had been promoted from color expert to bailiff of aesthetic justice, and wore a security guard uniform that was clearly a Halloween costume. Doris sat in what Brenda called the jury of peer homeowners, though she was already dozing despite the proceedings not having started. Brendan stood at a makeshift prosecutor's table, wearing what appeared to be a judge's robe over her business suit. Carl sat at another table labeled Color Expert Witness, looking like he wanted to disappear into the earth. Doris was in the jury box, a row of lawn chairs, already napping, despite the fact that proceedings hadn't started. Brendan was setting up multiple cameras, treating this like a major production. "Order, order in the paint court," Brenda banged, a gavel that looked suspiciously like a meat tenderizer. "We are here today to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mason Brooks has committed crimes against interior aesthetics and property values." She began her opening statement, which involved a 45-minute presentation on the history of white paint, complete with slides showing paint through the ages. The crowd was more interested in their tacos and Brandon's commentary, but Brenda pressed on. "I call my first witness," she announced dramatically, "myself." She walked from the prosecutor's table to the witness stand, apparently planning to question herself. "State your name for the record, Brenda Morrison. And what is your expertise in paint colors? I have spent 5 years studying the impact of improper paint choices on neighborhood harmony." She continued this bizarre self-interrogation for another 30 minutes, occasionally objecting to her own questions and then overruling herself. Carl tried to look professional by taking notes, but I could see it was actually doing a crossword puzzle. The crowd was taking bets on how long this would last. Even the dogs that had gathered seemed confused by the spectacle. The self-examination reached peak absurdity When Brenda began introducing evidence of her expertise, she presented certificates from online courses she'd taken, including color theory for beginners, a free YouTube tutorial, advanced white paint selection, a Home Depot workshop, and something called certification in aesthetic law that appeared to be printed on her home computer. She held each one up to the crowd as if they were diplomas from Harvard. As you can see, I am uniquely qualified to judge paint crimes. The crowd's reaction ranged from amused chuckles to outright laughter. Someone shouted, "Show us your paint law degree," which caused Brenda to launch into a 10-minute explanation of why traditional legal education was biased against color justice. Then Brenda brought out her evidence. She had prepared 50 paint samples, each meticulously labeled, and proceeded to hold them up under 20 different types of lighting to demonstrate their variations. As you can see, under the full spectrum LED, this eggshell white maintains its integrity, while this, she held up another sample that looked identical. This imposter shows clear, warm undertones. The demonstration might have been more effective if a gust of wind hadn't blown half her samples across the park, causing several dogs to chase after them. Children were now using the paint samples as frisbees, while Brenda frantically tried to maintain order. Her next piece of evidence was even more elaborate, a scale model of the neighborhood made from cardboard with each house painted in what Brenda considered the correct shade of white. My house was painted bright red with a skull and crossbones drawn on it. This represents the danger that non-conforming colors pose to our community, she declared. The model was actually impressive in its detail, suggesting she'd spent considerable time on this project. Each house had tiny labels indicating their color compliance score and risk assessment rating. Jorge's house had a yellow warning sticker for borderline beige garage door. That's when the situation escalated beyond even Brenda's usual absurdity. 3 police cars pulled up to the park and officers Martinez, Rodriguez, and Wilson stepped out. The crowd immediately perked up. This was better than cable television. "Is this the paint lady situation?" Rodriguez asked Martinez, who nodded wearily. Wilson had actually brought popcorn from Mrs. Roberts' stand. "I heard about this at the station. Had to see it for myself." Brenda's eyes lit up. "Perfect. Officers of the law, you're just in time to witness justice being served." She rushed over to them with her binder of evidence. "I need you to arrest Mason Brooks for violation of community paint standards." Martinez stepped forward, trying to maintain professional composure. "Ma'am, we've been over this. There is no law about interior paint colors, and even if there was, you can't hold a trial in a public park." "This isn't just any trial," Brenda insisted. "This is a matter of neighborhood integrity. Look at this evidence." She began pulling out her paint samples again, holding them up to the officers. "Can't you see? This is eggshell white." She held up one sample. "And this is the abomination in his house." She held up another sample that looked exactly the same. Wilson compared the 2 samples, then held them up to his uniform. "Hey, Danny, this one matches my badge." Rodriguez took a selfie with the color chart. "Getting this for the station? They won't believe it otherwise." Martinez was clearly trying not to laugh, as Brenda grew more frantic. "This is not a joke," she screamed. "I have never been laughed at in my life." "This is about standards, about order, about paint," Wilson said, finally, cracking. "You're having a breakdown about paint. That's when Brenda did something none of us expected." She threw herself dramatically onto the ground, spreading her arms wide like she was making a snow angel in the grass. "I will not move until justice is served. I will lie here until Mason Brooks admits his color crimes." She began to sing to the tune of "We Shall Overcome, we shall paint it white, we shall paint it white, we shall paint it white." "Son, that's when it happened." Wilson let out a snort of laughter. Rodriguez tried to cover his mouth but failed. And Martinez, professional Martinez, who'd probably seen everything in his 20 years on the force, finally lost it. All three officers burst into laughter. The laughter started with Officer Wilson, who tried to disguise it as a cough, but failed miserably. Officer Rodriguez bit his lips so hard I thought he might draw blood, but when Brenda started the second verse of her paint-themed protest song, he lost it completely. But it was Officer Martinez, the seasoned professional, who'd maintained his composure through the cherry picker incident and the self-interrogation spectacle, who really set things off. His laughter came from deep in his belly, the kind that makes your whole body shake. In 20 years he gasped between laughs. 20 years of police work. This is, he couldn't finish the sentence. The entire crowd was now laughing. Even Carl had given up pretending to be professional and was wiping tears from his eyes. The taco truck owner was laughing so hard he had to sit down. Dogs were barking joyfully, sensing the mood. Only Brenda remained on the ground, still singing her paint protest song with increasing desperation. That's when she pulled out what she clearly considered her ultimate weapon. Still lying on the ground, she reached into her bag and pulled out a canvas. "You think this is funny?" she shrieked. "I'll show you funny. This is my masterpiece. 5 years of work." She held up a painting of what appeared to be a house, painted entirely in different shades of white. "I used 47 different whites to create the perfect home. This is what everyone's house should look like." Rodriguez actually stopped laughing for a moment to admire it. "Actually, that's pretty good, Mum. You're talented. Thank you. I mean, no, focus on the color crimes." But the compliment had thrown her off her game. She scrambled to her feet, grass stains now decorating her judge's robe, and tried to regain control of the situation. "Officer Martinez, you said you studied interior design. Surely you understand the importance of proper paint selection." Martinez wiped his eyes and tried to compose himself. "Ma'am, I did study interior design. And you know what I learned? Color is personal. What looks perfect to one person might look terrible to another. There's no universal law of paint colors, but there should be," Brenda wailed. "Without standards, we have chaos, anarchy, people painting their walls." Their walls. She paused, seeming to realize she'd lost her train of thought. "Salmon pink," she finally screamed as if this was the worst profanity she could imagine. Martinez decided to try a different approach. "Okay, Mrs. Morrison, let's say hypothetically that Mr. Brooks' walls are the wrong shade of white. What law exactly gives you the right to camp outside his house, fly drones by his windows, and rent cherry pickers to peer into his bedroom?" Brenda opened her mouth, then closed it. She opened it again. "The law of a community standards, the law of property values." "The law of Ma'am," Wilson interrupted, still chuckling. "Those aren't real laws. You made them up. I didn't make them up. They're on my website, Oculatis HOA. The website you made yourself," Rodriguez added helpfully, "on Wix with clip art." This seemed to break something in Brenda. She looked around. At the laughing crowd, the officers barely maintaining composure, her nephew Carl hiding his face in his hands, and finally at her husband Richard, who had just arrived. Richard surveyed the scene with the weary expression of a man who'd been through this too many times. "Brenda, honey, it's time to go home." But Richard, the paint crimes, the tribunal, justice, "Sweetheart," Richard said gently, "our house is painted off-white. You literally chose a color that wasn't on your own approved list." The revelation hung in the air like a particularly awkward paint fume. Brenda stared at Richard, then at her paint samples, then at the still chuckling officers. That's different. Our house it's a special exception because But even she seemed to realize how ridiculous she sounded. The fight went out of her like air from a punctured balloon. Officer Martinez seized the moment to wrap things up. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to be very clear. You need to stop harassing Mr. Brooks. No more camping, no more drones, no more cherry pickers, and definitely no more fake trials. If I have to come back here for another paint incident, we're going to have a very different conversation involving actual charges. Do you understand?" Brenda nodded mutely, her paint samples scattered around her like fallen soldiers. The crowd began to disperse, still chuckling and sharing videos. Brandon was already uploading content with titles like Paint, Lady Meltdown, Military Epic Finale. Mrs. Roberts patted my shoulder as she passed. "That was better than anything on streaming services, dear." As the officers prepared to leave, Martinez pulled me aside. "For what it's worth, I drove by your house earlier. Your walls look fine, completely normal." I don't know what she thinks she saw, but he shrugged. Some people just need a hobby that doesn't involve harassing their neighbors. I watched as Richard gently led Brenda away, Carl quickly packing up the paint court supplies. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered the cherry picker incident, and the feeling passed. "You'll regret this," Brenda whispered as she passed me, her voice RO from singing. "I'll be back. Justice for paint will prevail. But karma, as they say, has its own color palette." And it was about to paint Brenda into a very tight corner. The immediate aftermath of the paint court fiasco was swift and surprisingly official. Officer Martinez had to file a report about the incident, which meant Brenda received a $500 fine for disturbing the peace and creating a public nuisance. The judge, a real one this time, also issued a restraining order requiring her to stay at least 100 FT away from my property. Problem? Brenda's house was only 98 FT from mine, which meant she had to take a creative route through her backyard and around the entire block just to get to her own front door. Watching her measure the distance with a tape measure while Carl held the other end was perhaps the most satisfying thing I'd seen in weeks. But the real karma came from an unexpected source. Brenda's insurance company had received a claim from her about neighborhood property value degradation due to improper paint, colors. She'd apparently been building a case to sue me for theoretical damage to her home's value. The insurance company sent an inspector to evaluate her claim. The inspector, a no-nonsense woman named Janet, took one look at Brenda's house and immediately found problems, not with the paint color but with actual code violations. The paint Brenda was so proud of, it turned out to be lead-based paint from 1987 that had been painted over multiple times. The previous owners had never properly remediated it, and now it was flaking in several places. "This is a serious health hazard," Janet informed a stunned Brenda. "You'll need to have the entire exterior stripped and repainted by certified professionals. No more DIY paint jobs. The estimated cost, $25,000. The remediation notice arrived on the same day Brenda had been planning to file her lawsuit against me. Richard later told me we'd become friendly after the incident, that she stood in their kitchen holding both documents looking like someone had told her that white paint had been outlawed entirely. Meanwhile, the neighbors decided to take action to prevent future Brendake incidents. We formed an actual legitimate HOA with proper bylaws, elected officials, and registered paperwork. The nomination process was simple and unanimous. Everyone wanted me to be president. I refused 3 times before finally accepting, mainly because Jorge threatened to nominate Brenda out of spite if I didn't take the job. Our first official HOA meeting was held in the same park where Brenda's paint court had taken place. The first order of business, establishing paint color, guidelines, motion to approve. All paint colors are acceptable as long as they're not actively offensive or violating city ordinances. I read from the official agenda. All in favor, everyone raised their hands. Motion to add, no one named Brenda. Morrison shall hold any position of authority in this HOA ever. Jorge added with a grin. Do we really need that? I asked. Yes. The entire room responded in unison. We added it. The second rule passed unanimously. As a celebration of our new reasonable HOA, I decided to make a statement. I painted my mailbox in rainbow colors, each stripe a different, vibrant shade. It was visible from Brenda's window exactly 101 FT away. Legal, colorful, and absolutely infuriating to someone obsessed with monotone aesthetics. Brenda, for her part, tried to salvage something from her paint obsession. She opened a consulting business called Brenda's 50 Shades of White, offering color advice exclusively focused on white paint varieties. The business cards, which she distributed to every house in the neighborhood, thrown from exactly 100 FT away, featured the slogan, "Because off-white is off-limits to good taste." The venture was not successful. Her only client was her mother, who hired her out of pity and still gave her a 3-star review. She knows her whites, but needs to work on her people's skills. 6 months later, Officer Martinez was doing his regular patrol when he saw me outside painting my front door. He pulled over and walked up, careful to admire my work from a respectful distance. "Salmon pink?" he asked, with a knowing smile. "Yep," I replied, applying another coat. "I actually kinda like it. Plus, it's fun to watch Brenda's reaction through her binoculars." We both looked toward Brenda's house, where, sure enough, a pair of binoculars quickly disappeared from a second-floor window. "Some things never change," Martinez chuckled. "At least she's staying the legal distance away." "Oh, she still sends weekly emails about color violations," I said. "I've set up an auto-reply that just says all colors are beautiful with a rainbow emoji." She sent 47 responses so far. Martinez laughed again, the same deep belly laugh from the paint court incident. "You know, this story still gets told at the station. Wilson even wrote it up for his memoir chapter on weird calls. You're going to be famous." As Martinez drove away and I continued painting my door, its cheerfully offensive salmon pink, I reflected on the whole bizarre experience. I'd learned about 47 different shades of white paint, discovered the importance of a good HOA with reasonable people running it, and realized that sometimes the best way to deal with someone's obsession is to let them paint themselves into a corner. Brenda still lived 2 houses down, still obsessed with paint colors, still watching my house with her binoculars from exactly 100 FT away. But now she was contained, restricted by law and common sense from inflicting her color theories on others. But every time I saw her walking the long way around the block to get to her front door, measuring the distance with her phone's GPS to make sure she didn't violate the restraining order, I couldn't help but smile, not out of malice, but out of appreciation for the perfect shade of karmic justice. And you know what? My walls are still off-white, not eggshell white, not ivory cream, not winter snow, just off-white. And every time I look at them, I remember that I have the freedom to paint them any color I want. Because that's what home ownership is really about. Not following someone else's arbitrary rules, but making your own choices, even if that choice is salmon pink, especially if it's salmon pink. If this story made you feel better about your own life choices, our job is done.